The morning of October 25th, 1944. Lieutenant Commander Robert Fowler stands in the cockpit of his TBF Avenger, engine idling on the deck of USS Gambier Bay, and he's about to break the laws of physics, or at least what the Japanese Imperial Navy believes are the laws of physics. Below his aircraft hangs a Mark 13 torpedo, 2,000 pounds of high explosive and propulsion machinery, slung in the internal bomb bay. On his wings, secured to hard points that shouldn't exist according to enemy tactical manuals, are two more gifts: 1,000-pound general-purpose bombs. Another 2,000 pounds. 4,000 pounds total, on a single-engine carrier aircraft, flying from an escort carrier with a flight deck barely 500 feet long. The Japanese fleet steaming toward him 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, 11 destroyers had planned for American air attacks. Their doctrine accounts for torpedo bombers, their anti-aircraft crews train for dive bombers. Their evasive maneuvers assume one aircraft equals one weapon type, one attack vector, one defensive response. What they haven't planned for is an aircraft that refuses to choose. Fowler releases his brakes. The Avenger lumbers forward, impossibly heavy, impossibly laden. The right radial engine screams. The deck falls away. And somewhere in the Combat Information Center of the Japanese heavy cruiser Haguro, a radar operator is about to file a report that his superiors will not believe. This is the story of how American industrial pragmatism created a weapon that Japanese naval doctrine insisted could not exist, and how that single design decision changed the mathematics of carrier warfare forever. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand why the TBF Avenger represented an impossibility to Japanese naval planners, we must first understand the rigid logic that governed carrier aviation in 1942. Every navy operated under the same constraints. Aircraft carriers were floating airfields with severe limitations. Deck space was precious. Hangar capacity was finite. Every aircraft represented a compromise between capability and weight, between firepower and fuel, between specialization and versatility. The solution, universally adopted, was specialization. Fighters protected the fleet and engaged enemy fighters. Dive bombers attacked from altitude, targeting ship superstructures, flight decks, and deck-mounted weapons. Torpedo bombers approached at wave-top height, releasing their weapons to strike below the waterline where armor was thinner. 3 aircraft types, 3 distinct roles, 3 separate waves in a coordinated strike. This wasn't arbitrary. It was physics and tactical necessity combined. A torpedo, specifically the American Mark 13 or the Japanese Type 91, weighed approximately 2,000 pounds. Carrying such a weapon required a robust airframe, a powerful engine, and significant structural reinforcement. The weight penalty was severe. Adding anything else, additional bombs, extra fuel, heavier armor pushed the aircraft beyond what carrier catapults could launch or what carrier decks could safely recover. The Imperial Japanese Navy had perfected this system. Their Nakajima B-5N, designated Kate by Allied intelligence, was arguably the finest torpedo bomber of 1941. At Pearl Harbor, Kate's devastated battleship Roe. At the Battle of the Coral Sea and Midway, they proved their worth repeatedly. The Kate could carry one 1,800-pound Type 91 torpedo or an equivalent weight in bombs, never both. The aircraft's loaded weight of 9,500 pounds was already pushing the limits of what the Akagi and Kaga could efficiently operate. American doctrine mirrored Japanese thinking. The Douglas TBD Devastator, the U.S. Navy's frontline torpedo bomber, in 1942, operated under identical constraints: 1 torpedo or 1,000 pounds of bombs. The choice was binary. The aircraft's maximum gross weight of 10,000 pounds left no margin for additional ordnance. At the Battle of Midway in June 1942, this limitation proved catastrophic. Torpedo Squadron 8, flying devastators from USS Hornet, attacked the Japanese carrier force without fighter escort. All 15 aircraft were shot down. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise lost 10 of 14 aircraft. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown lost 10 of 12. Of 41 torpedo bomber crew members who attacked that morning, only 6 survived. The Devastator's tactical limitation was simple. To deliver its torpedo, it had to fly straight and level at 115 miles per hour, at an altitude of less than 200 feet, for the final 3,000 yards of its approach. Every anti-aircraft gun on every Japanese ship could target that predictable geometry. The Devastator carried no defensive armament sufficient to suppress that fire. It could not maneuver. It could not vary its attack profile. One aircraft, one weapon, one predictable approach. The equation favored the defender. But even as Devastators were dying over the Pacific, their replacement was already in production. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, based in Bethpage, Long Island, had received the Navy contract for a new torpedo bomber in April 1941. The specification called for improvements over the Devastator: better speed, better range, better defensive armament. Standard evolutionary development. Grumman's chief engineer, William Schwendler, proposed something different. Something that violated the weight assumptions every other naval aircraft designer accepted as immutable. He proposed an aircraft that could carry everything. The ex-TBF-1 prototype first flew on August 7, 1941, 4 months before Pearl Harbor. Observers from the Bureau of Aeronautics watched a machine that seemed to defy carrier aviation logic. The Avenger, it wouldn't receive that name until October 1941, was enormous. Empty weight, 10,555 pounds, heavier than a loaded Devastator. Wingspan, 54 feet 1 inch. Length, 40 feet 11.5 inches. It was the largest single-engine aircraft the Navy had ever attempted to operate from carriers. The Wright R2 614 Cyclone radial engine produced 1,900 horsepower, at takeoff 50% more than the Devastator's engine. It needed every bit of that power, because Schwendler had designed something unprecedented: an internal bomb bay large enough for a full-sized torpedo, plus external hardpoints on the wings. The torpedo bay, located in the center fuselage, could accommodate the Mark 13 torpedo, the same weapon the Devastator carried. But, unlike the Devastator, where the torpedo hung externally in a disruption to the aircraft's aerodynamics, the Avenger's weapon nestled inside the fuselage. Doors closed after release, reducing drag. The wing hardpoints were the innovation that Japanese intelligence would fail to fully appreciate until combat revealed their significance. Initially, the Avenger carried 4 hardpoints, each rated for 500-pound bombs. The standard loadout: 1 torpedo plus 4 500-pound bombs, 3,000 pounds total. This was already more than Japanese doctrine considered possible for a carrier aircraft. But American engineers kept refining the design. By 1943, the wing hardpoints were upgraded. Each could now carry 1,000-pound bombs, 2 per wing. The internal bay still carried its torpedo. 4,000 pounds of ordnance on a single aircraft, with a gross weight of 17,900 pounds. To put this in context, a Japanese Kate carried 1 torpedo weighing 1,800 pounds. An American Avenger carried 1 torpedo weighing 2,000 pounds, plus 2 bombs weighing 1,000 pounds each. The Avenger delivered more than twice the ordnance of its Japanese equivalent. But raw numbers don't convey the tactical revolution this represented. Japanese naval doctrine, refined through war games at the Naval War College in Tokyo and combat experience in China, assumed specific ratios. To attack a capital ship, a battleship, or fleet carrier with sufficient probability of critical damage, you needed multiple torpedo hits. 3 hits would mission kill a battleship. 2 hits might cripple a carrier. Therefore, doctrine called for massed attacks, 6 to 9 torpedo bombers per target, attacking from multiple bearings to split defensive fire and complicate evasive maneuvers. The math was simple. If each aircraft carried 1 torpedo, you needed 6 to 9 aircraft. American commanders learned the same: mathematics. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, It took multiple waves of Devastators and Dauntless dive bombers to sink the Japanese light carrier Shoho. At Midway, despite the Devastator's sacrifice, not a single torpedo hit a Japanese carrier. The dive bombers attacking separately, in a different wave, achieved the decisive strikes. The lesson seemed clear. Carrier strikes required coordination between specialized aircraft types, attacking in sequence or from multiple vectors. The Avenger changed the equation. A single Avenger could attack like multiple aircraft simultaneously. It could approach at torpedo altitude 200 feet or less, forcing the target ship into evasive maneuvers and concentrating anti-aircraft fire low. Then, during the final approach, it could release its wing bombs first, forcing the ship's gunners to track multiple incoming threats from a single aircraft. Or it could vary the approach. Climb to dive bomber altitude 82. 10,000 feet, release the wing bombs in a shallow dive, then descend for a torpedo run while the ship is still evading the bombs. Or it could split targets. Attack a screening destroyer with wing bombs while continuing toward the primary target, a cruiser or carrier, with the torpedo. The tactical flexibility was unprecedented. Japanese naval commanders, training since the 1920s in the doctrine of specialized aircraft roles, had no framework for responding to an aircraft that refused specialization. Lieutenant Minoru Genda, one of the Imperial Navy's finest tactical minds and principal planner of the Pearl Harbor attack, encountered Avengers at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. His post-war testimony to American interrogators included this observation. "We understood Americans had new torpedo bombers with improved performance. Intelligence briefings mentioned increased speed, better armor, but the attack patterns we observed were inconsistent with single-weapon aircraft. Initial assessment was that radar counts were incorrect, or that Americans had developed new aircraft types not yet identified. The Japanese hadn't miscounted. They were simply witnessing something their doctrine insisted was impossible. One aircraft generating the attack complexity of 3 aircraft. By mid-1943, Grumman and General Motors, which produced the aircraft under license as the TBM variant, were manufacturing Avengers at a rate of more than 300 per month. By the end of 1944, nearly 10,000 had been built. The Japanese attempted to develop equivalent aircraft. The Aichi B-7 Ryusei Grace to Allied intelligence was designed as a carrier-based attack bomber with multi-role capability similar to the Avenger. The prototype flew in May 1942. It was fast, maneuverable, and could carry a torpedo plus bombs. But production delays, engine problems, and the catastrophic attrition of Japanese carriers at the Philippine Sea meant that only 114 were manufactured. Most never saw combat. The few that did operate from land bases, not carriers, in the desperate defense of the Japanese home islands in 1945. Japan had the engineering capability. What they lacked was time, industrial capacity, and crucially the carrier decks to operate such aircraft from. By 1944, Japan's carrier force was effectively destroyed. The ships still floated, but the trained aircrew, the irreplaceable veterans who had struck Pearl Harbor and Darwin and Ceylon, were dead. America, by contrast, was launching new Essex-class fleet carriers every few months. Each carried 90 aircraft. 15 to 18 of those were Avengers. The mathematics of attrition were brutal and simple. Japan could not replace losses. America could lose an entire air group and have a fresh one aboard within weeks. But numbers alone don't explain psychological impact the Avenger had on Japanese naval commanders who encountered it in combat. For that, we must turn to October 1944 and the waters off Samar Island in the Philippines, where American escort carriers faced a Japanese surface fleet that should have annihilated them. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was not one battle, but 4 separate engagements spread across 3 days, fought in seas surrounding the Philippine archipelago. It was the largest naval battle in history, measured by tonnage engaged and area covered. More than 200,000 men participated. Japan committed virtually its entire remaining operational fleet. America deployed the massive 3rd and 7th fleets. The Japanese plan was complex: relying on precise coordination between three separate task forces converging on Leyte Gulf, where American forces were supporting General Douglas MacArthur's return to the Philippines. Vice Admiral Gisaburo Ozawa's Northern Force, 4 carriers with play, only 116 aircraft aboard. So depleted was Japanese naval aviation would lure Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet north, away from the landing beaches. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force would transit the San Bernardino Strait, and Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force would come through Surigao Strait. Both would converge on the American transports and supply ships in Leyte Gulf. The plan assumed American carriers would pursue Ozawa's decoy force. The battleships and cruisers of the center force would then have free access to the vulnerable transports. The plan nearly worked. On the morning of October 25th, Kurita's center force emerged from San Bernardino Strait into the Philippine Sea. His fleet was formidable. The battleships Yamato, Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna Yamato being the largest battleship ever constructed, displacing 72,000 tons and mounting 9 18-inch guns. Supporting them were the heavy cruisers Haguro, Chokai, Kumano, Suzuya, Chikuma, and Tone, along with light cruisers and 11 destroyers. Against them stood Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's task unit, 77.4.3 radio call sign, Taffy 36 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. Escort carriers were not designed for fleet actions. They were converted merchant hulls with small flight decks, top speed of 18 knots, thin armor, and light armament. Their purpose was anti-submarine patrol and close air support for amphibious operations. Each carried approximately 28 aircraft, 12 Avengers, 12 Wildcat fighters, 4 Wildcats configured for reconnaissance. The Avengers aboard Taffy 3's carriers that morning were not configured for anti-ship attack. They were loaded for ground support missions. Some carried general-purpose bombs. Some carried rockets for attacking Japanese fortifications. Some carried depth charges for anti-submarine work. A few, perhaps a dozen across all 6 carriers, carried torpedoes. None were configured with the full 4,000-pound loadout the aircraft was capable of carrying. But as events would prove, they didn't need to be. At 6:58 a.m., lookouts on the escort carrier Fanshawe Bay spotted pagoda masts on the horizon. Japanese warships. At first, the Americans assumed these were friendly ships, Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet returning from the north. Within minutes, as the range closed and the distinctive silhouettes became clear, they realized their mistake. Kurita's battleships opened fire at 7:01 a.m. from 35,000 yards, nearly 20 miles. 18-inch shells from Yamato began falling around the American carriers. Each shell weighed 3,200 pounds. A single hit would destroy an escort carrier. Rear Admiral Sprague later wrote in his action report, "The situation was critical. The enemy force was overwhelming. We had no battleships, no cruisers, no chance of escape in a surface action. Our only asset was aircraft and the courage of our crews." At 7:04 a.m., Sprague ordered all carriers to launch all aircraft immediately. Attack enemy surface force. Use anything you've got. Lieutenant Commander Edward Huxtable, commander of Composite Squadron 65 from Fanshawe Bay, was already in his Avenger when the launch order came. His aircraft carried a single Mark 13 torpedo and 2 500-pound bombs, 1,500 pounds total, well below the Avenger's maximum capacity, but more than a Japanese Kate would carry into such an engagement. His after-action report, filed 3 days later, provides the first American documentation of the tactical phenomenon that would define the Battle off Samar. Proceeded to target bearing 270, distance approximately 12 miles. Observed enemy heavy cruiser, Tone class, maneuvering at high speed. Commenced attack run from starboard quarter, altitude 200 feet. Released wing ordnance at 4,000 yards to suppress anti-aircraft fire. Continued approach, released torpedo at 1,200 yards. observed near miss from wing bombs, direct hit from torpedo amidships. The cruiser slowed, began listening to port. One aircraft, one pilot, multiple weapons employed in sequence against a single target. But more significantly, Lieutenant Commander Robert Fowler, the officer we met at the beginning of this account, flying from Gambier Bay, filed a report that reveals the psychological dimension of the Avenger's impact. During the attack approach on enemy battleship Congo class, noted heavy anti-aircraft fire, very accurate, released wing bombs from 3,000 yards. Observed enemy gunfire cease momentarily, then resume with less accuracy, targeting incorrect altitude. Continued to 2,000 yards, released the torpedo. During egress, observed enemy gunfire tracking behind aircraft, suggesting confusion about attack profile. The Japanese gunners had prepared for torpedo bombers. They knew the profile: low, slow, steady. They knew the timing: a continuous approach at fixed altitude, the aircraft becoming more vulnerable as range decreased. What they encountered was an aircraft that released weapons early in the approach, forcing gunners to track bombs arcing toward the ship. Then continued the attack while the ship's crew was still responding to the first threat. Captain Koyanagi Tomiji, commanding the destroyer Fujinami in Kurita's screen, survived the battle and was interviewed extensively by American naval intelligence in 1946. His testimony includes this observation: "The American torpedo planes attacked differently than we trained for. Our doctrine assumed torpedo release at 800 to 1,000 meters, single weapon. These aircraft attacked from 2,000 meters or more, releasing multiple weapons. Our gunners attempted to follow. The doctrine concentrate fire during final approach, but the aircraft released their torpedoes beyond the range we expected. By the time we adjusted our fire solution, the aircraft was evading, and our shells were passing behind." This wasn't incompetence on the part of Japanese gunners. It was doctrine meeting reality. Japanese anti-aircraft crews had trained against a specific threat profile based on the limitations of aircraft they knew. The Avenger's ability to attack from extended range, made possible by carrying its torpedo internally with reduced drag, and to complicate the defensive problem by releasing bombs first, rendered that training inadequate. The battle off Samar lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. At 9:25 a.m., Admiral Kurita ordered his fleet to withdraw. This decision has been debated by historians for 80 years. Kurita commanded overwhelming firepower. Despite fierce resistance from American destroyers and destroyer escorts, several of which charged, the Japanese battleships in suicidal torpedo attacks Taffy 3 should have been annihilated. Kurita was less than 15 miles from the transports and supply ships in Leyte Gulf. His mission was nearly accomplished, but he withdrew. Post-war interrogations reveal several factors. Kurita believed he faced fleet carriers fast, heavily armed, with large air groups not escort carriers. The intensity of American air attacks supported this belief. His ships were taking damage. The heavy cruisers Chokai, Chikuma, and Suzuya were all crippled or sunk by air attack. American destroyers had hit the heavy cruiser Kumano with torpedoes. But perhaps most significantly, Kurita's combat reports recovered from Japanese archives after the war reveal confusion about American attack patterns. One entry reads, "Enemy air attacks continuously and from multiple directions. The number of attacking aircraft appears inconsistent with radar contacts. Believe the enemy has reinforcements from fleet areas not previously identified." The Japanese were experiencing what military theorists call sensory overload. They were tracking individual Avengers, seeing them release bombs, then seeing the same aircraft continue to attack with torpedoes. Their mental model insisted these were separate aircraft bomb-carrying dive bombers and torpedo-carrying attack planes. But the count didn't match. Some Japanese commanders believed they were facing twice the number of aircraft actually attacking them. This wasn't irrational. It was a trained response based on doctrine that said, one aircraft type equals one weapon type. When doctrine encounters evidence that contradicts it, The human mind attempts to preserve the doctrine by reinterpreting the evidence. In this case, Japanese commanders reinterpreted the Avenger's multi-role capability as evidence of more numerous forces. That reinterpretation affected Kurita's decision calculus. If he believed he faced larger American forces than actually existed, withdrawal made tactical sense. The Battle off Samar ended American victory, not because of superior firepower. The Japanese had overwhelming advantages in that regard, but because American industrial philosophy had created an aircraft whose tactical flexibility exceeded Japanese doctrinal assumptions. One historian calculated that the Avengers at Samar, despite being loaded for ground attack rather than anti-ship missions, delivered approximately 300% more ordnance per aircraft than Japanese doctrine predicted was possible for carrier-based torpedo bombers. Mathematics broke Japanese tactical planning at the most fundamental level. The tactical surprise at Samar was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a technological and doctrinal divergence that had been developing since 1942, rooted in fundamentally different philosophies about how to win an industrial war. To understand this divergence, we must examine not just the Avenger itself, but the American industrial system that produced it, and the Japanese strategic assumptions that failed to account for it. In 1942, as the first production Avengers began reaching fleet squadrons, the United States was engaged in the largest industrial mobilization in human history. The scale is difficult to comprehend. In 1941, American aircraft production totaled 19,000 aircraft of all types. By 1944, that number had reached 96,000 aircraft per year. The increase wasn't gradual, it was exponential. Grumman's Bethpage plant, which had employed approximately 6,000 workers in 1940, expanded to employ 25,000 by 1943. The assembly line for the Avenger ran 24 hours per day in 3 shifts. Components arrived from subcontractors across the Northeast, engines from Wright Aeronautical in New Jersey, propellers from Curtiss in Ohio, instruments from Sperry in Brooklyn. The logistics alone represented a triumph of industrial coordination, but Grumman couldn't meet demand alone. In 1942, the Navy contracted with General Motors to produce the Avenger under license. GM's Eastern Aircraft Division, operating plants in New Jersey that had previously manufactured automobile components, retooled for aviation production. By 1943, GM was producing more Avengers designated TBM rather than TBF than Grumman itself. The total production run between 1942 and 1945, 9,839 aircraft, nearly 10,000 Avengers. This from an aircraft that Japanese intelligence initially assessed as too heavy for sustained carrier operations and unlikely to be produced in significant numbers due to complexity. Japan, by contrast, produced approximately 1,265 Nakajima B 6N torpedo bombers, Kate's successor, during the entire war. The newest design, the Aichi B-7A, saw only 114 aircraft completed before war's end. The disparity wasn't simply a matter of industrial capacity, though American manufacturing advantages were overwhelming. It was also a matter of design philosophy. Japanese aircraft designers pursued performance optimization. The Zero fighter, the Kate torpedo bomber, the Val dive bomber all were exceptional aircraft when introduced, representing the peak of what could be achieved within weight and structural constraints. They were elegant machines, carefully balanced between competing demands. But optimization comes with a cost: inflexibility. When combat revealed the need for increased armor, more powerful engines, or additional weapons capacity, Japanese designers struggled to modify airframes that were already operating at their performance limits. The Zero, for instance, remained in production throughout the war with only incremental improvements because fundamental redesign would have disrupted production schedules Japan could not afford to lose. American designers took a different approach. They built margin into their designs, extra structural strength, more powerful engines than initially necessary, hard points and mounting systems for weapons that didn't yet exist. The Avenger embodied this philosophy. Its airframe was overbuilt by Japanese standards. That extra strength allowed continuous modification throughout its service life. The wing hardpoints that initially carried 500-pound bombs were strengthened to carry 1,000-pound bombs. Then modified to carry rockets, the 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rocket, 11 of which could be mounted on underwing rails. Then adapted to carry the tiny TIM rocket, which weighed 1,300 pounds and was designed to destroy reinforced bunkers. Then modified again to carry early air-to-surface radar pods for night operations. The Avenger that attacked Japanese shipping in 1945 bore little resemblance to the aircraft that debuted at Midway in 1942, yet it retained the same basic airframe. This was intentional design philosophy, build adaptability into the structure from the beginning. Commander Richard Upson, who flew Avengers from USS Lexington throughout 1944, noted in his memoir published in 1978, "We'd return from a mission, and within days, ordnance crews would be installing new weapons systems, rockets where bombs had been, radar pods where auxiliary fuel tanks mounted. The aircraft absorbed every modification. Japanese prisoners we interrogated were baffled by this. They'd been trained on the capabilities of the American Torpedo bomber based on intelligence from 1942, but by 1944 they were facing what was essentially a different aircraft with the same silhouette. This adaptability extended beyond the aircraft itself to operational doctrine. American carrier task forces, by mid-1944, were experimenting with mixed loadouts within the same squadron. A typical Avenger squadron of 12 aircraft might have 4 configured for anti-submarine patrol with depth charges, 4 loaded with torpedoes for anti-ship work, and 4 carrying bombs and rockets for ground attack or strike missions against small vessels, all from the same basic aircraft type. Japanese carriers, when they still had functioning air groups, maintained rigid specialization. Fighter squadrons flew fighters. Torpedo squadrons flew torpedo bombers with torpedoes. The flexibility to rapidly retask aircraft based on tactical developments was limited by both doctrine and the physical limitations of specialized aircraft. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated these doctrinal differences with devastating clarity. On June 19th, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa launched the last great Japanese carrier strike 373 aircraft from 9 carriers, targeting Task Force 58 under Admiral Mark Mitcher. Ozawa's plan relied on superior range. Japanese aircraft, lighter and with less armor than American equivalents, could attack from distances American fighters couldn't reach. The Japanese strike would hit American carriers, then land at bases on Guam to refuel and rearm before attacking again on the return flight. The plan failed catastrophically. American radar detected the Japanese strike waves at extreme range. F-6F Hellcat fighters, directed by increasingly sophisticated combat air patrol coordination, intercepted Japanese formations before they reached the American fleet. Of 373 aircraft launched, approximately 300 were shot down. Japanese aircrew losses were staggering veteran pilots who could not be replaced. That afternoon, American search planes located the Japanese fleet. Mitcher launched a counterstrike at extreme range 216 aircraft, including 54 Avengers. The Avengers attacked in the failing tropical twilight. Ozawa's fleet attempted evasive maneuvers, but the ships were low on fuel after days of high-speed operations and could not sustain maximum speed indefinitely. Japanese combat air patrol had been depleted during the morning engagement. Lieutenant Commander Ralph Weymouth, leading VT-14 from USS Wasp, filed an after-action report that revealed the tactical evolution American squadrons had undergone. Divided squadron into 3 divisions. First Division attacked screening destroyers with wing bombs and rockets to suppress anti-aircraft fire and create confusion. Second Division commenced torpedo runs on carrier Hio from Port Quarter, while 3rd Division attacked from starboard bow. Coordination with VB-14 dive bombers ensured simultaneous arrival of bombs and torpedoes on target. This was combined arms doctrine applied to carrier aviation, different weapons from different vectors arriving simultaneously to overwhelm defensive capabilities. The Avenger's versatility allowed American commanders to treat each aircraft as a multi-role platform, combining with specialized dive bombers to create attack complexity that Japanese defensive doctrine couldn't counter. The carrier Hyo took multiple torpedo hits and sank. The carrier Zuikaku, one of the 6 carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor, was damaged and forced to withdraw. The battleship Haruna took bomb damage. Several cruisers and destroyers were hit. But perhaps more significant than the immediate damage was the psychological impact on Japanese naval commanders. Captain Toshikazu Ome, serving on Ozawa's staff during the battle, wrote in his post-war memoir, "We observed the American attack and recognized we faced a fundamental disadvantage. Not merely numerical, we understood American industrial capacity exceeded ours, but tactical. Their aircraft attacked in ways our defenses were not designed to counter. A single aircraft type performed missions that required 3 aircraft types in our doctrine. We could not train our gunners to defend against attack profiles that changed based on the tactical situation rather than aircraft type." This assessment, written with the clarity of hindsight, identifies the core issue. Japanese doctrine was prescriptive. Aircraft performed specific roles in specific ways. American doctrine, by 1944, was adaptive. Aircraft performed whatever role the tactical situation required, limited only by what ordnance was available and what the pilot could conceive. The Avenger, with its multiple hardpoints and flexible loadout options, embodied this adaptive philosophy. By late 1944, as American forces advanced across the Pacific, Avengers were flying missions that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. They conducted anti-submarine patrol, dropping depth charges on Japanese submarines attempting to interdict supply lines. They flew close air support for marine landings, hitting bunkers and fortifications with bombs and rockets. They attacked Japanese shipping, laying mines in harbors or torpedoing cargo vessels. They flew radar-equipped night interdiction missions, hunting Japanese vessels attempting to supply isolated garrisons under cover of darkness. Lieutenant George Schelling, who flew Avengers from USS Hornet during the Philippines campaign, described the versatility in a 1984 oral history interview. "We'd fly 3 or 4 missions in a day, each one different. The morning mission might be anti-submarine patrol. In the afternoon, we'd strike a Japanese convoy. In the evening, we'd hit shore installations supporting ground forces. Same aircraft, different ordnance. The plane didn't care. You loaded what you needed, flew the mission, came, back, rearmed for the next one." This operational tempo was sustainable because the Avenger was mechanically reliable. Grumman's reputation for building rugged aircraft earned with the F-4F Wildcat fighter extended to the Avenger. The Wright R-2 600 engine, despite its power, was a proven design that Navy mechanics understood. The hydraulic systems were robust. The flight controls were straightforward. Combat damage that would destroy lighter Japanese aircraft often left Avengers flyable. Aviation radioman 2nd Class J. Manning, who flew as turret gunner in VT-11, recalled returning to USS Hornet after a mission over Formosa with 63 holes in his aircraft from anti-aircraft fire, 1 engine cylinder damaged, and hydraulic fluid leaking from multiple punctures. The pilot landed safely. The aircraft was repaired overnight and flew the next day. This durability was intentional. Grumman engineers had designed the Avenger to absorb battle damage and continue functioning. Fuel tanks were self-sealing. Critical systems had redundancy. The airframe structure included multiple load paths, so damage to one structural member didn't cause catastrophic failure. Japanese aircraft, optimized for performance and weight reduction, lacked this margin. A zero hit by a single .50 caliber bullet in the wrong location often caught fire. The aircraft carried no armor around the fuel tanks to save weight. A Kate struck by anti-aircraft fragments might suffer control failure because the control cables, routed for aerodynamic efficiency, were vulnerable to damage. These design choices reflected different assumptions about the nature of the war each nation was fighting. Japanese designers assumed a war of decisive fleet actions, short, intense engagements, where performance advantages would prove decisive. American designers assumed a war of attrition, where sustainability, replaceability, and adaptability would matter more than peak performance. By 1944, it was clear which assumption better matched reality. The Pacific War had become exactly what Japanese strategic planners feared: a grinding attrition contest where American industrial advantages compounded over time. Every Japanese aircraft lost was increasingly difficult to replace. Every pilot killed represented irreplaceable expertise. By mid-1944, Japanese naval aviation training programs had been shortened from 18 months to 6 months, then to 3 months. As fuel shortages and losses of training aircraft made comprehensive instruction impossible, American training, by contrast, expanded. Pilots arriving at fleet squadrons in 1944 had logged 300 to 400 hours of flight time, including gunnery training, navigation exercises, and formation flying. They arrived at their carriers already competent in basic skills, ready to learn combat tactics from experienced squadron commanders. The quality gap became self-reinforcing. Experienced Japanese pilots, flying in increasingly desperate circumstances with inadequate support, died in disproportionate numbers. Green replacement pilots, inadequately trained, died even faster. American pilots, benefiting from better training, better aircraft, and better support systems, survived to become experienced veterans who could train the next cohort. By Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the average Japanese naval aviator had perhaps 50 hours of total flight time. American pilots averaged more than 400 hours. The skill differential was overwhelming, but even veteran Japanese pilots, survivors of years of combat, found themselves tactically disadvantaged when facing American formations that included Avengers. Flight Petty Officer Sadamu Komachi, who flew A6M0s from land bases in the Philippines, survived the war and was interviewed in 1989. He described engaging American strike packages. "We attempted to intercept before they reached our ships. The American fighters' Hellcats were very difficult, fast, heavily armed, aggressive. But we were trained for fighter combat. The torpedo bombers were different. Our doctrine said attack them during their torpedo run, when they are slow and straight. But these American bombers released their bombs first, while still maneuvering. Then they scattered. Some continued to torpedo altitude, others climbed. Our formations became confused, trying to follow multiple attack profiles from the same aircraft type. The American fighters then attacked while we were disorganized. This tactical dynamic Avengers, creating confusion in Japanese formations. Allowing American fighters to exploit that confusion became standard American doctrine in 1944 and 45. The Avenger wasn't just a weapons platform. It was a tactical complexity generator that forced Japanese defenders to divide their attention and resources. Japanese naval commanders recognized the problem but lacked solutions. Building aircraft comparable to the Avenger required industrial capacity Japan didn't have. Retraining defensive crews required time and resources that didn't exist. Changing fundamental doctrine, always difficult in any military organization, was nearly impossible in the crisis conditions of late 1944. So Japanese forces fought with the doctrine and equipment they had, knowing both were inadequate. The final large-scale engagement of Japanese naval aviation came in April 1945 during Operation Tengo, the suicide mission of the battleship Yamato. The last operational Japanese carriers remained in port, unable to launch aircraft due to lack of fuel and trained pilots. Yamato, the largest battleship ever constructed, sortied from Japan's inland sea with 9 escorts on a one-way mission to beach itself on Okinawa and fire its massive guns in support of the island's defenders. American submarines detected the force shortly after departure. Search aircraft tracked its progress. On April 7th, Task Force 58 launched massive strikes, 386 aircraft, including 98 Avengers. The Avengers attacked in coordinated waves. Some carried torpedoes, some carried bombs, some carried both. The attack lasted 2 hours. Yamato took at least 10 torpedo hits and 5 bomb hits. The battleship capsized and exploded, killing 2,498 of its 2,767 crew members. Among the Avenger pilots who attacked Yamato was Lieutenant Thomas Stetson from VT-9 aboard USS Yorktown. His after-action report noted, "Approached from port quarter, released 2,000-pound bombs from 4,000 feet during dive, pulled out at 1,000 feet, proceeded to torpedo release point. Observed bombs impact forward of bridge, continued approach, released torpedo at 800 yards. Observed hit amidships, starboard side." Stetson's attack profile dive bombing followed immediately by torpedo attack from the same aircraft would have been impossible for any Japanese torpedo bomber and incomprehensible to Japanese naval officers trained before the war. It represented the culmination of 3 years of American tactical evolution, enabled by an aircraft designed for flexibility. Yamato's sinking marked the effective end of the Imperial Japanese Navy as a fighting force. The irony is profound. The battleship, representing the ultimate expression of traditional naval power, destroyed by carrier aircraft that embodied industrial age pragmatism over martial elegance. The Avenger continued in service after Japan's surrender in August 1945. The aircraft flew anti-submarine patrols during the early Cold War, served in the Korean War, attacking North Korean supply lines, and remained in Navy squadrons until 1954, when it was finally retired from frontline service. But the aircraft's true legacy wasn't its longevity. It was the design philosophy it represented and the tactical lessons it taught. Modern multi-role strike fighters, the F/A-18 Super Hornet, the F-35 Lightning II, are direct descendants of the Avenger's approach. These aircraft carry air-to-air missiles for defensive capability, precision-guided bombs for ground attack, anti-ship missiles for naval targets, and electronic warfare equipment for suppression of enemy defenses, all on the same airframe, all changeable based on mission requirements. This is normal now. In 1942, it was revolutionary. The American defense establishment learned from the Avenger that adaptability and sustainability matter more than specialized optimization in industrial warfare. That an aircraft capable of multiple roles, even if not the absolute best at any single role, provides more combat value than a collection of specialized aircraft that each excel in narrow circumstances. The Japanese lesson was harder. Post-war Japanese self-defense force doctrine emphasized flexibility and multi-role capability, a direct response to the rigid specialization that hampered Japanese forces during the war. But the lesson came at tremendous cost, hundreds of thousands of lives lost in a conflict where industrial capacity and adaptive design philosophy proved more decisive than martial spirit or tactical elegance. Lieutenant Commander Mamoru Aoki, whom we met at the beginning of this account, did not survive the sinking of the Chokai off Samar. His ship took multiple torpedo and bomb hits from American aircraft, several from the same Avengers, attacking with multiple weapons. The cruiser sank within hours. Among Aoki's personal effects, recovered after the war, was a journal. One entry, dated October 23, 1944, 2 days before the battle, reads, "We are steaming to engage the American invasion fleet. Our force is powerful. 4 battleships, including Yamato. 8 cruisers. Victory is possible if we can reach the landing area before American carriers locate us. Intelligence reports say Americans have new aircraft types, faster, better armed. But our crews are experienced. We understand carrier warfare. We will succeed." The confidence in that entry is striking. Aoki was not foolish. He was a competent officer, operating with the best information and training his navy could provide. But that information and training were based on assumptions about carrier aviation that the Americans had already rendered obsolete. 2 days later, when Avengers from Taffy 3 attacked his ship with weapons his doctrine said they couldn't carry, those assumptions collapsed. The psychological shock, the realization that the enemy had changed the fundamental rules of engagement, may have been as devastating as the physical damage. This is perhaps the deepest irony of the TBF Avengers story. Japanese naval aviation in 1941 was the finest in the TBF world. Japanese aircraft designers were brilliant. Japanese pilots were superbly trained. Japanese tactical doctrine was sophisticated and battle-tested. And none of it mattered when confronted with an enemy who didn't care about doing things the proper way, who instead built an aircraft that was too heavy, carried too much, violated the careful optimization that elegant design required, and simply overwhelmed the opposition through raw capability and industrial mass production. The Avenger wasn't the best torpedo bomber ever built if you measure best by speed or maneuverability or aerodynamic efficiency. Japanese and British designs arguably exceeded it in specific performance metrics, but it was the most effective because it refused to choose. Torpedo or bombs? Both. Dive attack or low level? Either. Anti-ship or anti-submarine or ground attack? Whatever the mission requires. That refusal to accept limitations, that fundamentally American approach of solving problems through capacity rather than optimization, changed naval warfare forever. And by the time Japanese commanders understood what they were facing, understood that their elegant tactical doctrine was being shattered by industrial pragmatism, it was far too late to matter. The war was already decided, not by any single battle, not by any brilliant strategy, but by 10,000 design decisions in factories across America, each one choosing capability over elegance, weight over grace, and brutal effectiveness over refined tradition. The TBF Avenger was the embodiment of that philosophy in aluminum and steel, a flying manifestation of industrial warfare's ultimate lesson. In a long war, adaptability and mass production defeat specialization and finesse. The monster the Japanese didn't see coming wasn't the aircraft itself. It was the industrial system and military philosophy that conceived it, built it in overwhelming numbers, and deployed it with tactics that Japanese doctrine had no framework to counter. By October 1944, standing on the bridge of the Chokai as impossible loads of ordnance fell from aircraft that shouldn't exist, Mamoru Aoki had seconds to comprehend this truth. It wasn't enough time. The Pacific War taught many lessons, but perhaps none more fundamental than this. In industrial conflict, the side that builds adaptable tools and uses them flexibly will defeat the side that builds perfect tools for specific circumstances. The TBF Avenger proved that lesson at Samar, at the Philippine Sea, at Leyte Gulf, and in 100 smaller engagements across the Pacific. One aircraft, multiple weapons, unlimited adaptability. The Japanese calculated what was possible based on their understanding of physics and doctrine. The Americans built something heavier and flew it anyway. That difference decided the war. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.